Hi, welcome to God Stories today. My name's Chris Thompson. You guys coming? Hello there and welcome to God Stories today. I feel really privileged today because I've actually got a bishop in the studio, Bishop Nick McKinnel, Bishop of Plymouth. Thank you so much for being here. I know you're a busy guy. It's really wonderful to actually have your time.
Very nice to be with you, Chris.
Bless you. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your God story. I really am. Bishop, who are you? Snapshot of who you are now.
I'm a dad, a grandfather, a husband, a priest, a bishop, and an ordinary citizen of Plymouth.
That's wonderful. There's a lot there, but in terms of who you are as a human being, how would you describe yourself personality-wise?
I think I'm on the whole energetic, positive, sometimes weary, but you get worn down by life.
Yeah.
Generally upbeat, probably slightly reserved, but then that comes with years. I'm beginning to feel my age. I get my free bus pass this year. So there we are, something to look forward to.
Indeed it is. This is your God story, so I want to take you right back to the beginning, if I may. Where were you born?
I was born in Liverpool, and then when I was aged about 3, we came down to Devon, where my father worked in Exeter, and my earliest memories of our small house in Wipton in Exeter. And then when I was about 6, we moved out to a little town in Devon called Bradnich.
All right. So do you associate yourself with Liverpool? If you were to sort of say, what am I in terms of...
Well, I support Liverpool.
Oh, you do?
FC.
Do you like the Beatles?
I do like the Beatles. And I did
pretty
work,
wrong if you didn't.
No, but I worked in Liverpool for a bit. So I was a university chaplain in Liverpool for 4 or 5 years in the 80s. So we have lived there actively, as it were. But I was born there. My dad was a student at the time, dental student. They got married. Both families were from Cheshire. And then he came down to Exeter to set up his own dental practice.
Right. So moving to the part of your life then when you're down here, what were you like as a child? Because you were about, 6 or 7, did you say, when you came down to this part of the world?
Yeah, younger than that. But yeah, 6 or 7 when we moved out to a country town, that sort of idea. So I'm the eldest of 5 children.
Oh, yeah.
So very responsible. The eldest is always the most responsible.
And firstborn.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have always enjoyed sport. In fact, I played cricket yesterday.
Did you?
I'm aching from it.
Did you
First
win?
game of the season, we lost. Exeter
Drats.
Diocese has a clergy cricket team. And it's quite a long time since we've won a game, to be quite honest. But we lost yesterday against the Bristol clergy. But they were full of young ordinands from Trinity College, Bristol. So.
We both love them and hate them at the same time.
Yeah. Whereas we were an elderly bunch of clergy doing our best. But we got into 3 figures.
Okay.
I dropped a key catch, so I'm still sort of suffering. My ego is suffering from that and my hand.
Oh dear.
So sport was always quite high up. I didn't find academic stuff too difficult, so I enjoyed that. And always seemed to have a bunch of friends around too.
And what about faith? Were you brought up as a Christian?
Well, we used to go to our village church. So going back in the family tree, we've got various clergy and people like that. So my grandparents, certainly on mum's side, were really seriously sort of committed to their church. Grandfather was a church warden. And my parents used to take us along to our village church. And when that didn't go through a very good phase, we actually hopped over the hill to Columpton, went to the church there for a little bit. So church is familiar, and I was away at boarding school for a bit, so we had chapel most weeks and every Sunday there. So I got very familiar with the stories of the Bible, with especially the prayer book in those days, but evensong and matins, and later we had things like what was it called, Order One, and all these different things. I can't remember what they were called now. The alternative service book, those sort of Series 1, Series 2. So all the way as the church changed and modernised its liturgy, I was somewhere along the stage trying to follow it and so on. So I was comfortable within the church, but I suspect for me faith was about trying to live well and do good things rather than centred really, as it should be, on what God had done for me.
I was just going to ask that actually. At that age, that tender age where, as you said, church was becoming familiar for you and a safe place for you, was God becoming personal to you at that time as well? Was your faith becoming an intimate thing with God, or was that yet to arrive and happen?
Well, I would pray.
Yeah.
So I guess that means that, that was important enough to think that God was there. And although I suspect I prayed, usually for sort of, say, selfish things. When I was fishing, I can remember praying that I'd catch a fish.
Win the cricket.
Or when the exams were coming out, I prayed that I'd do well and everything. So I certainly had a good nodding acquaintance with God, is probably how I would put it. I would have called myself Christian, but possibly admitted I wasn't a very good one.
With all that in mind then, this question I'm about to ask you might not be so sort of pertinent, but some of the other interviewees have said that their relationship with God has gone through seasons. Sometimes God, especially at the beginning of a relationship with God, it felt like God was a policeman in the sky, a good policeman in the sky, but very authoritative, waiting, if you like, to sort of snap at you the moment you did something wrong, all that kind of stuff. If you can cast your mind back to that season of your life yet again, how did God feel to you? I mean, what was your appreciation of him? Did he feel like a father? Did he feel like a graceful father, or was it something else?
I think a lot depends possibly on your personality and your family background. So because I wasn't brought up in a sort of judgmental sort of family, I didn't think of God particularly like that. I think I was aware of the holiness of God because, the liturgy and the buildings where we'd have gone on a Sunday were quite imposing. So I was aware of the otherness of God. But, praying the Lord's Prayer, you pray Our Father, don't you? So I guess I possibly had a certain sort of old man in the sky sort of image derived from Michelangelo or whatever. But I'd also have felt here is somebody I could talk to and didn't cringe before or worry about too much.
That's wonderful. So when you got into your teenage years, what was your faith like then? Was it developing? Had it sort of stayed the same in the way that you just described? Were there any penny dropping moments when you were in your teenage years?
Well, I think in my school years, there wasn't a lot of time to think about really what I believed. I was confirmed at the age of probably 15 or 16, and the school chaplain who prepared me for confirmation. And when I said, well, I wasn't very sure about things, he said something like, well, do you think love is a good thing? And I said, well, yes. So he said, well, God is love, so carry on and get confirmed. So I don't think I had a lot of input of any serious sort like that.
Okay. Was it, sorry to interject, but I just feel prompted, and this might be a good thing. Were there any sort of like swirlings in your heart at that stage in your teenage years about calling to the priesthood, which I know might sort of sound, well, actually no, because I've just said that my faith was of a certain sort of like type at the time. But I remember myself and my calling to the priesthood, I felt like there was a possible calling to the priesthood even before I would say my faith came alive and I was a practicing Christian where my faith was everything in my life. I felt like there was something in me from God sort of saying, well, in the future, this is what I want you to do. So it was like, it was all confusing, but nonetheless it was there.
Right, I think I'd be vaguer than that, but I do remember seeing our village vicar and thinking, well, I could do a better job than that. so I don't know if that's a calling to a priesthood or not really. But, okay. We did have some very tedious vicars and sermons that we were dragged along to. So church was a bit of an endurance, but, we went out of a sense of duty. I don't think I particularly would have said my faith was important enough that I'd have thought of doing it for a job, as it were, in those days.
So from what you've just said then, would it be? I take it there weren't really many mile marker moments of intimacy with God.
Not at a spiritual level. No.
Gotcha.
No.
So when did it all come alive for you? Then,
Okay, so I went up to Cambridge University to read law in 1972, and had a room next to somebody whose faith they obviously took a lot more seriously than I did.
Right.
And I remember him. It was on Advent Sunday, 1972. Saying to me, come along and listen to a good speaker on the Christian faith who's on, I forget quite where it was now, probably in Great St Mary's or something,
right,
in Cambridge at that time. So I went along, and it turned out to be David McKinnell, who was quite a well-known preacher and evangelist in those days. And I remember hearing him speak, and he spoke about Jesus as somebody who one could know, as someone who was attractive, who was just able to move at ease with everybody. The stories that I knew from my background began to make sense. He explained why Jesus had come, why he died for us, that on the cross he'd taken our sin on himself, and offered forgiveness and particularly a sense of purpose, which I think I was aware that I was lacking in my life.
Could you talk about that a little bit more, the sense of purpose?
Well, so, you as a teenager, you begin to think, well, why are we here? What's important? You're at a university where all sorts of people are arguing different things. I was studying law, but not very sure that I really wanted to spend my entire life doing that sort of thing. I'd done a bit of a placement out in Brussels for the European community, I suppose it was in those days, and could see interesting things like that developing. But I think within me, I thought, well, what's really worthwhile? Are these things particularly worthwhile? Where did I want to go? I didn't feel particularly certain about that. And then here was Jesus presented as someone through whom life could make sense. And, here was somebody worth following as opposed to many of the other gurus and sort of philosophies that were around. Here's someone that offered forgiveness and whose personality was such that it was sort of unique, really. And so I felt this is something to explore further.
So there was obviously a penny dropping moment that evening, or whatever it was, in Cambridge. Dr. Jeff Stevenson, when I interviewed him, he went to Cambridge as well, and he had an experience which seems to resonate with what you're talking about, whereby he was asking questions about the purpose of life, the meaning of life, and other such stuff, and he prayed to God and sort of asked that question, what is it all about? And there was if I remember right, there was a 2-week period after asking that prayer, of praying that prayer, where God really did some amazing things of opening his heart and his mind up to who he is, and so forth. Did you have that sort of journey? Did you have? Well,
I certainly felt different. So I certainly prayed, God, if you're there, I want to know you. And I did feel a sense of calm and purpose and peace, which in a sense I've had ever since, I suppose, amid all the sort of travails of life. So, I would think that I like to put it that my rather dormant, maybe slightly academic sort of faith or churchiness came alive through, not just through that talk, but through then engaging, reading, trying to find out more, listening to other speakers, reading books,
right?
That sort of thing. So I guess I feel that my sort of personal relationship with Jesus grew properly from those sort of days.
And was there a sense of calling around that sort of time? Was that starting to bubble up at the
same time? Well, a sense of calling in that, if God is real and Jesus Christ reveals him, then that is great news for everybody to know. So there was a sense of calling that you can't just discover all this and sit in a pew, but we're called to ministry in the broader sense, to make this known, to live out the implications of the gospel. So in that sense, it was life changing, but I didn't quite know what I was going to do with it.
You said something very, very quickly in that dialogue about Jesus making sense of things. I know you're on a journey, and you're at the beginning of that journey in some sort of sense, but could you explore that a little bit more, if I may ask that? What did that mean for you, Jesus making sense of things?
Okay, so I like, that verse John 10:10, that I've come, to give life and life in all its fullness, and to have Jesus Christ as a companion through life, and to feel therefore rooted to the love which is at the heart of the community, whole of the universe really, somehow begins to make sense of who we are and why we are here. So happens tonight I'm preaching at a university service, and I'm going to take Psalm 8 as my text. What is man that thou art mindful of him, the Son of Man? And that psalm asks a question about who we are, and it says we're worshippers, looking at the heavens and seeing all that there is, that we're questioners, that we think, what is this universe about? What is humanity for? That we're carers, that we're there to care for creation, the psalm ends by saying. So I think to discover who Jesus is, also to discover the sort of people that we as human beings are made to be. And maybe that doesn't instantly drop from the skies as an insight, but life begins to make sense in terms of what our humanity is, what our priorities are, how we should treat other people, what sort of world we want to live in, where justice comes in and concern for the poor, and those sort of things that mean that we begin to live life in the way that God intended, and that therefore begins to make sense for us.
I was going to ask this question at the end, a theological question. The famous quote from Irenaeus, which I'm going to get wrong, so bear with me. It's something along the lines of, the glory of God as a human being fully alive. And you're touching on that now. So if there was some way for the viewers you could summarise what that means for you, just so they can have a snapshot, so a takeaway moment. Like, is there anyone here, especially someone who's not a Christian, and exploring what you're just talking about, what is the purpose of life? What is the meaning of life? What makes sense of anything? And you're saying Jesus. Well, if part of the ramification of that is the beautiful notion that actually it makes a person fully alive, what is it to be fully alive?
Well, theologically, I'd say it's to have a doctrine of creation and a doctrine of redemption. So a doctrine of creation to really enjoy and appreciate the gift of God's world, a fallen world, a world that sometimes is groaning, a world there's a great deal of pain, but a world that we engage with and we try to live out God's kingdom in. So there's a doctrine of creation about just being part of life and savouring it and enjoying it as God's gift. And there's doctrine of redemption, which says actually Christ has redeemed the world, that we can live in a fallen world, but knowing that quality of eternal life which he promises to us. So it sounds a bit too theological to put it like that.
It's fine.
I mean, it's basically to enjoy. We're made body, mind, spirit, emotions, personality, and for all of those things to be integrated in a way that we're working towards a wholeness, which will only happen on the other side of once we're in heaven, I think. But to be part of God's activity in the world, to know his spirit in our life is what I think Jesus means by life in all its fullness.
The interviewee before you was a guy called Reuben Crossley.
I know Reuben.
He was a wonderful guy, and he talked about how, as a physio, people would come to him for physio, of course, but often, maybe it was a Holy Spirit thing, those conversations that were had during the physio would move towards people saying, well, this is great, but what about the purpose of life? What about the purpose of life? And he said it was so frustrating because he couldn't sort of engage with them in the way that he wanted to about Christianity. But the conversation that we had, both in the interview and beyond the interview, if that's the right way of describing it, sort of talked about what it is to be fully alive, to actually be plugged into the very meaning of existence, and for that to give you the ultimate purpose, no matter what you're striving for, what position you've got, no matter what job you've got or are hoping to get, no matter what your circumstances are, it's the thing that trumps it all. You're plugged into the rivers of living water, and it makes sense of I was going to say everything, but not quite that. But it just is. Well, it's the source of all life.
I think it's seeing life, isn't it, in some ways as a gift for which one is grateful. So I think that's where the Trinity comes in and is significant. So, we understand God the Father giving us the world that we're in, God the Son redeeming us, making us, forgiven people. But then God's Holy Spirit living within us, enabling us to be the sort of people that God wants us to be, and to live the sort of lives, begin to live the sort of lives that he would long for us to do so. And as we do so, not only does life make sense, but amid all the sort of difficulties and tragedies, there's still a joy which trumps everything.
Going back to your story, you're studying law in Cambridge, which must have been really hard, because I've been to Cambridge and it was hard. So you're studying law in Cambridge. What happened next in terms of your story? Did anything happen whilst you were there for the 2 or 3 years doing Tripros, I'd imagine, or whatever it is called in Cambridge, if it's law? Or was it that when you left Cambridge, things started to happen and develop from then?
I think at Cambridge, there was the enormous privilege of hearing really good preachers, of having good friends, some of whom I'm still in touch with, that my faith was able to develop alongside the sport I was doing and the academic stuff I was doing. But I did come to the end of my time there, not sure what to do, not really feeling that I wanted to have a legal career. And it so happened that a job came up with a Christian overseas development agency called Tearfund, and for 2 years I went to work for them. They have
What's that like? I love Tearfund. I love what they do.
Yeah, they are great, really. Like? I mean, it was in those days a very young organisation led by a very dynamic guy called George Hoffman, and every year our income was doubling. So it was growing.
Happy days. It was
full of young people, absolutely. We went from 250,000 to 500,000 to 1 million over the time I was there, and it was a young, unshackled organisation that could see where there was need in the world and target it, find good people to go there. The churches were amazingly generous in supporting it. I remember one couple where I think he was a teacher, she was a nurse. They decided they could live off his salary. Everything she earned, she sent directly to us.
Wow.
And we had sort of major projects in places like Bangladesh that was suffering from flooding very badly in those days. Sudan, I remember, Nepal, India.
Did you get to go to these places?
I didn't. I was in the overseas personnel department, so I was resourcing the people. We had 100 or so people who were short-term workers overseas, medics and things. So I resourced them, kept in touch with them, sent them the football results, made sure they got their money, those sort of things. And then I did go to Israel because I was in charge of organising work teams that went out to projects in the Sudan, in Israel, somewhere else, and so I did go with them to, we did building work. And
you must have seen God move quite dramatically in those times.
Well, I saw
frontline stuff.
Yeah, so it was very exciting to be there. I mean, I think it's still an exciting and a really good organisation, but there was an energy about it. Some very talented people called together to work for it. You would just see the vibrancy of some of the Christians in other parts of the world. So it was wonderful to meet church leaders from Africa and Asia, South America, who would come and tell about what God was doing there. It was, of course, thoroughly ecumenical in the sense of a Baptist, Methodist, Anglican, so it was good for me to move out of my little Anglican straitjacket and to see and to worship with others and to see things happening. And you also realise that although we think, through an organisation like that, we are doing good over in somewhere else in the world, how paternalistic that can be and how sort of post-colonial. And we receive, in terms of spiritual life and energy, far more than we're able to give when we really understand what.
Were there any moments where that really came to the fore, where they were like, you kind of thought, okay, we're going to give so many resources to this area of the world and such expertise, but actually you went there and ended up being ministered to yourself?
Well, I remember somebody coming back, I think a doctor who'd been in Nigeria for 3 years, and him talking about the sort of reverse culture shock he had here. So, there he was with people out in Nigeria struggling, hardly anything on the shelves. Then you'd come back to England, 27 different types of breakfast cereal on the shelves, an affluence, and the contents of one of our supermarket trolleys being the entire annual wage of a pastor out in the area that he'd come from. Wow. And feeling how unsettled he was by that, and how lukewarm some of our churches here compared to the joyful worship that he'd experienced, and the life and death situations that he'd been dealing with day by day in a very materially poor part of the world.
Did you learn something about faith then, in sort of its life and death sort of fashion? In places of extreme need, of mortal need, faith becomes, I wanted to say, of a reality that perhaps...
Well, you need God, you sort of need God, don't you, in that sort of culture. And I think materialism dulls our awareness of our need of God. It doesn't, mean that God isn't there, but, if we're materially comfortable, it's quite difficult to be spiritually sharp very often. And I was reminded of that recently because the Diocese of Exeter, which I'm a bishop in, is twinned with the Diocese of Thika, which is north of Nairobi in Kenya.
Nice.
And I took a little group of about 20 of us out there last November, and we went out to the east of the diocese, where if the rains don't come, people die. And then in the west of the diocese, you're up on the coffee plantations, and it's much more affluent and everything. But wherever you were, there was a joyful worship and a willingness to talk about God in a natural way, which simply isn't part of our culture in the UK or most of our culture.
What did that do for your faith and your sense of God?
Well, it's just lovely to be with brothers and sisters from a different tradition, which lifts our hearts, and you just see for them that life without God would not just be meaningless, but would be, really difficult, because he's trusted for almost every meal in some parts of the world. And, a joy amid material suffering and lots of deprivation. But also in the particular area we were in, the Christians there are making an enormous difference to the whole community of the village. So they're providing, the local people are understanding, say, irrigation and offering it to their neighbours. They're pooling their resources so that 10 people chipping a bit together can make more happen than doing things individualistically. So we are a fairly individualistic society here, aren't we? People have like a nice fence in front of their house and often don't know who they live next door to. There's none of that there. There's a community living, a dependence on each other. It's far from perfect, but quite challenging to lots of the ways that we see things here.
God, it's inspiring. It really is so inspiring. What happened then? So you're in Tearfund.
I worked for Tearfund for 2 years, and during that time explored the possibility of ordination into the Church of England. So I went to worship at a church called St Paul's on Onslow Square, and it was, in those days, it was really quite easy to get ordained.
What year was this?
75 to 77.
Okay.
Went to see the vicar there, who was a chap called Raymond Turvey, and he said, "Oh, you want to go and see the bishop?" So I went to see the Bishop of Kensington, and he said, "Are you sure you want to? You can serve God, without being ordained, lots of other ways." I said, "Well, I did feel an inner conviction that this is what I wanted to do," and he said, "Well, that's fine. Let's send you off to a selection conference."
Is that how it worked then? No DDO, no sort of...
No
it
DDO.
was just a quick chat with a bishop. I'm sure there was more to it.
Well, it was an hour's chat. It was an hour's chat.
That's quick!
Yeah. It was, shall we say, a lot less complicated than the processes that people have to go through now.
Okay, cool.
So it was as simple as that. I went off on a selection conference.
Which, it's 3 days now. What was it like?
Yeah, it was pretty similar. This was in a convent in Ealing, and I think they had 3 selectors and we just had 3 interviews. I can't remember a lot about it really. But it all seemed fairly straightforward. I got a letter saying, that's fine. I was sponsored by the Diocese of London. And
how did you feel at that point? Can you remember?
I felt, I felt this
The
just
whole life is
naturally
about
is
to
the
change.
right stage to do. I was quite looking forward to going back to study theology properly. And it just felt the right thing. So nothing very dramatic. It just seemed...
There was a click in your heart.
If it hadn't worked, I'd have happily gone and done something else. So I felt I was sort of offering myself if I was wanted. But, there were plenty of other things I could have done. But it did feel to me as if this is a role I would be satisfied in personally, but also that would allow me to proclaim the gospel and share my faith and be part of a living community and so on.
So where did you train?
Trained at a place called Wycliffe Hall in Oxford.
Good.
3 years. Yeah, food was terrible. Friends were nice. Did a 2-year sort of Oxford degree because I had a degree already, so I could do that in 2 years. Really enjoyed patristics, which is studying the church fathers and how the early Christian message became regularized, as it were, through and made accessible to a Greek culture and to the other cultures of their age.
Pertinent for today.
Well, it is, actually, it is. You realise how, Irenaeus and all these other people, Origen and so on, all did it. And so there's challenges for today to think, well, how do we take, that New Testament gospel, the Greek way that it's formulated through the creeds, and make it relevant to today's Western world, just as those in Africa need to make it relevant to their world. So,
And where did you do your curacy?
So I went back to London to a church called St Mary's, West Kensington, which is on the Hammersmith Road. 10,000 people in a quarter of a square mile of a parish, large tenement blocks, very multiracial. Quite an exciting place to live. London's a good place to live. I'd lived in it when I worked for Tearfund, so I was happy to do that there. And it was a modern church with a lovely vicar and good things happening. Got a youth group going, did cypher camps or trips, took the kids off in the summer to do all sorts of things. And learnt the basics of parish ministry and visiting and funerals and weddings and dealing with choirs. And we didn't have bell ringers, we had a switch for the bells. You switched it to funeral, wedding or Sunday. And actually it was out of sync, so when it was a funeral you had to set it to weddings, and when it was weddings you had to set it to Sunday.
It's all part of training.
Yeah, exactly. Putting out a lot of chairs, meeting a lot of people, quite a lot of... I think it's probably quite a posh area these days, but in those days it was fairly down at heel. It was what's called a UPA, an urban priority area. And the congregation pretty much reflected the mix of the area.
And how was your faith growing at the time in your relationship with God?
Well, I think it was stretched by all the things that one had to do that you didn't quite know how to do, really. So, preaching and visiting and doing things casts you back to ask for God's help and think. So faith is a bit of a muscle, isn't it? The more you use it, the stronger it gets. I've always been quite disciplined about giving myself time with God at the beginning of each day. So, that was clearly helpful to pray through the day that was happening, look at the scriptures, see what the themes were, and try and live that out.
So how old were you at the time then when you did your curacy?
So I was ordained at the age of 25.
Oh, it's pretty young then, 25.
Yeah,
That's wonderful.
Yeah. By these days it is.
And what was your first job proper?
Well, I think that was a proper job.
Yeah, you know what I mean, post-curacy.
But I then went off to be the university chaplain in Liverpool, the Anglican chaplain.
Back to Liverpool.
So, yep.
That was a really bad accent.
Yeah, it was pretty terrible. But it is a vibrant city, a really interesting place to be. This was just after the riots. There'd been big riots in the early 80s, and Michael Heseltine had got the government taking Liverpool seriously. The Garden Festival was happening. It was a time of sort of resurrection from things. And we worked very closely. There's a strong Catholic chaplaincy, strong Catholic presence in the city. So I was the Anglican chaplain, good Methodist and Baptist colleagues. So we worked well together. And the happened to be a strong student group that I inherited, 100 or so students. So we
not many then.
go off to well, it wasn't my good work, but we go off to a place like Kinmel Hall in North Wales, and after exams we go off and do house parties at various places. And it was partly students, but it was also being chaplain to the whole institution of the university. Mm-hmm. So once or twice, one was called on. So the vice-chancellor very tragically dropped dead in front of a student demonstration while I was there. And obviously that was the sort of occasion when a chaplain was needed. Mm-hmm. And yeah, there were quite a lot of incidents around the place that others didn't really feel very able to cope with. So, I was involved in doing that, just being known around the place and there for people to collar if they had questions or wanted things to happen.
Throughout all this time, including the curacy and the training and so forth, were there any moments, I don't want to miss any moments like this, were there any moments where, I don't know, you had like real moments of intimacy with God, Holy Spirit filled moments and so forth, or even moments like that brought about because of wonderful successes and triumphs and so forth, or because there was a dark night of the soul going on in your life or in your ministry or something, and it sort of drew you closer to God and so forth? Were there any moments of intimacy like that, being filled with the Holy Spirit at that time? Or
well, I think there were. I think I take my Christian faith being almost a daily walk.
Yeah.
So clearly there are good days and there are days when you drift away a little bit, but there are lots of high points in terms of encounters with people, seeing God at work in other people's lives, being on conferences and good occasions and house parties where you saw lives change. And meanwhile, I like to think of God sort of chiseling away at my own life, trying to, make me more what He'd want me to be.
Right.
So
there was a steady.
Well, I think so, but
wonderful.
It's quite a long time ago now, really. There were some really good times when God felt very close. And I think you need that to sustain ministry, because you're giving out a great deal, aren't you, as a chaplain or a clergy person or even an ordinary Christian, really. And therefore you do need, just as you sort of give out, you need to receive from God in generously.
Which is why it's so important, as you say, to have that daily rhythm of prayer, that time, that discipline of being alone with God, so you can receive His energy. So you're a chaplain in Liverpool, and then what happened? What happened after that?
And then my father had died.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Down in Devon. Mum was on her own, and I'd felt a calling back to the county where I'd grown up for a while, really. I'd always sort of felt that this is, where, and my wife Jan felt, I think, much the same. And so we, in 1987, came back to Devon, and I was the priest in charge of a small town called Haverley, a market town just north of Dartmoor. Started with just the one church and parish. It soon became 4, and we arrived in Haverley with 2 small children, and we soon became 4 small children in the house. And it was just a really happy 7 years in a rural place where you would get to know everybody, where family services begin to fill the church. Our children were in Liverpool, the church we'd gone to, you could mess around, the kids could run around and all the rest of it. They weren't used to that in rural Devon. In fact, we were solidly prayer book when I arrived. But my children still felt they could run around. And one of the other young mums said, "Oh, well, if that's how the vicar's children behave, maybe I could bring my children to church." So bit by bit, we developed a nice congregation of young families as well as loyal older people. And it was parish ministry in a way that, you were in the pub and in the school and around the place, and in a really all-round, slightly old-fashioned way, really, but knowing everybody and
it's great.
Being there when there were the usual sort of tragedies that happen, and sadnesses and joys and weddings. And the dramatic thing that happened was on the when's the conversion of St Paul? January the 25th.
I'll tell you word for that one.
Something like that. 1990, very big storms hit Devon.
All right.
and it lifted the 60, 70-foot spire off the top of my church tower, plunged it through the medieval barrel roof. So the church
That's not what you want to
just
see when
like
you go
an
to church.
enormous bomb had gone off. So it was a very dramatic destruction almost of the church. It took £1 million to put it back together with the spire and all the rest of it, and people reacted in all sorts of ways, and it wasn't always a very easy thing. But it was one of those occasions where you felt, I'm right out of my depth here, but somehow the Lord comes alongside, enables you to do things that you could never really have done in your own ability. It made you pray hard. It brought out lots of good things from people, lots of divisions and difficulties as well. After that, I've not felt anything's been a big challenge, really. That was putting that together and putting the community together was a very exciting but stretching thing to do as well.
Talk about that though. You talked about relying on God in those moments where He's called you to do something beyond your human ability. What did that do for your faith and your intimacy with God?
Well, it strengthens it, doesn't it? It develops it.
Oh, great.
So, once you find God alongside you in one challenge, you can take on the next challenge with a bit more confidence. It also reminds you of your own frailty. When I'm weak, then I'm strong. You resonate a lot with the Apostle Paul and his awareness that, it was through his vulnerability and his weakness that God's power was shown. And he's keen to tell that to the Corinthians, who are very full of, wanting, very impressive personalities and so on. So knowing that it's not actually in the end our abilities and our competence which probably makes a great deal of difference, but in our weakness God's power is shown, and that became very clear. So we put the church back together, physically anyway, and spiritually in Hatherley, and it was great. A lot of people kind of came to faith or got confirmed and everything through identifying with the church and understanding how important it was to them. And during that time we met in a hall rather than a church, and people were in a semicircle and could see other joyful faces and so on. So all of that worked quite well, really. And then I felt, well, we'd done stuff there. The oldest child was 10 or 11 or something, and probably either going to stay there for a long time or should think about moving. So I was asked to apply for St Andrew's Church in Plymouth, which is a church in the middle of Plymouth, and I was appointed to that.
Was that a challenging time? Was it a time of your faith developing, or was it a steady time as some of these other experiences were?
Well, I think St Andrew's was quite a contrast to Hatherley. So suddenly there were, hundreds of people in church, and there were people, whereas in Hatherley you'd sort of had to have all the ideas and push people along a bit, because it's quite a conservative rural community. Here people were saying, Nick, what's your vision? What are we going to do? So it was almost been from one extreme to the other.
Right.
And St Paul Stonehouse was part of the team as well, really. And there was a team of clergy, 2 curates and a team vicar, youth worker and so on. So suddenly, as usual, out of my depth, but having to learn how we were to grow and move forward as a church. And lots of people were pulling in different directions a bit. So it was a question of thinking, well, where are we? What's God calling us to do? So it took a fair bit of praying, thinking, being on one's own, consulting with a team. Been blessed with some great lay people and church wardens and a strong team. And together we just led the church gently, in the sort of direction it was already going in.
And God moments along the way?
Well, I think God moments through meeting other people and, being with really encouraging Christian folk who were just a real encouragement, prayed for us, supported us. And that experience of God through a loving Christian community, which is often how he does speak to us particularly, isn't it, really?
So what happened next?
Well, I was there for 18 years.
18 years?
Yeah, 18 years. So the vicar of St Andrew's Plymouth. Yeah. So went through various phases and staff changes and gently grew year by year. And it's still in good heart.
So I take it we're leading up to the point where you got, I'm going to call it the call, to be a bishop. I don't know if it came at the end of your time at St Andrews or not, but was that next, or was there another appointment after St Andrews?
No, so I was 18 years at St Andrews, and I think probably expecting to retire from there. So, and then in 2012, I got tapped on the shoulder by the Bishop of Exeter, who said, well, you know, we're looking for a new Bishop of Crediton. Bob Evans, who was great Bishop of Crediton, had just left. You know, would I put myself in the frame? So
how did you feel?
Well, I felt uncertain about it because I, you know, think that the normal Christian life is in a local community and a local church, and that a bit suspicious of, you know, things that were too sort of broad and all the rest of it, really. But I was happy to be put in the frame. I think with all the jobs that I've done, I've sort of been apprehensive about going into them, but looking back, you feel, well, actually, yeah, that was God's call, and it is where He wanted me for that time. So I was interviewed. I think 3 people were interviewed altogether, and I was asked if I would accept it, which I was pleased to do. I mean, I've known Devon all my life. I felt committed to it. I wanted the church to flourish here. And if by being, you know, the bishop of somewhere, you can help that in a different way, make good appointments, you know, encourage churches, preach the gospel and so on, then I was up for doing that. So that was 2012. My first meeting with the other 2 bishops, Bishop Michael, who was Bishop of Exeter, said, well, actually, I'm about to retire. And the other bishop, the Bishop of Plymouth, said, well, I've just accepted a diocese in Australia. Within within about 6 months, I was sort of on my own doing 3 people's jobs while, you know, the search went on for a new Bishop of Exeter, and Bishop Robert was appointed. So I had a little spell when I was definitely out of my depth, but everybody was really supportive and helpful. And of course, I know lots of the clergy for, you know, years, really, played cricket with some of them, and, you know, been on deanery synods and so on. So everybody was very kind and supportive, and ensured that we didn't drop the ball too often.
What's it like to be a bishop? What's the best thing about being a bishop, and what's the worst thing about being a bishop?
The ordinal, when you're made a bishop, says that you're a shepherd to Christ's flock, a leader in mission, a guardian of the faith, and that you're to proclaim the gospel of God's kingdom. So the best thing about being a bishop is having the opportunities to do just that. So on Sunday I did confirmation in the morning, another one in the evening, and you were able to talk to a church full of people, often with visitors and families there, and sort of commission people to go and, you know, be disciples. And it's the same when you put a new vicar in somewhere, or prepare people for ordination or whatever it is. You're sort of commissioning people to go and serve God in their local place and so on. So that's a great thing to do, and it's and you often churches are at their best when you visit. So it's a special anniversary or confirmation or something like that, and that's a joy to do. What's the worst thing? Well, I don't know if there is a worst thing particularly. I mean, I do an awful lot of driving, so I did 52 hours in the car last month in April. So there's an awful lot of travel from that point of view, and you miss being part of a local Christian community.
Right.
So, you're used to having just a few people who you meet with, pray with, because in the end, that it's the local church where the gospel is preached, where people receive pastoral care, where healing and mission all takes place. So, I think the local church is the place that really matters, and the whole diocesan superstructure, and bishops included, is there to resource and strengthen the local church and enable it to do what God's calling it to do.
Have you got, it's a bit cheeky question this one, have you got any funny stories about being a bishop? And I'm going to own up to something as a priest here. I remember when I was in training, I heard all these funny stories from parish priests of lots of experience coming along saying, oh, this happened, the such and such blew up, or the such and such caught on fire, or the steeple fell into the nave, and I was like, and there was one particular guy who said, I nearly fell into a grave once. And I remember thinking to myself, you plonker. I wasn't very gracious at all. I thought it's never going to happen to me. And I remember I was in my curacy, and it was in a little village in Surrey called Bletchingley, and there was I think it was one of my very first sort of like graveyard sort of like funerals, and because a lot of them are in the Crem. And I went along to this cemetery, and I was quite nervous, to say the least. And they had like fake sort of grass around the actual grave itself, and I thought to myself, well, that must be sort of like the edge of the earth, the edge of the grave, as it were. And I felt pretty confident to sort of stand on it, and everyone was gathered around, and it was a really deep grave. I mean, like, it's really, really deep. They say 6 foot. This was more like, I don't know, 12. I think it was huge.
A good double grave.
Yeah, quite scary actually looking down into it. Anyway, I'm standing on the edge. I'm near the edge, and I'm feeling, reasonably confident about that. And then suddenly, the ground just gives way, because basically they put this fake grass
over the gap too.
Yeah, pretty much. And I'm like, whoa! And it was only because I was young and virile at the time that I was able to save myself. But literally, I was standing straddled over this grave, one leg either side. And thankfully, everyone had a really good sense of humour about it. You know what I mean? There I was with all my robes on and this, that, and the other. And just thankfully,
people do like it when something goes wrong.
Yeah,
don't they do like it.
So I don't know if you're allowed to say, but are there any bishop stories like that?
Well, I try and keep them to a minimum, as you can imagine, really. There was a time when my wife was quietly sitting anonymously in some licensing service, and the people in front said, why have we got to have the bishop? Oh, we've got to have the bishop. Oh, no. And then when they said to her, who are you? She didn't dare say, well, actually, I'm the bishop's wife, because she'd already heard the bishop being so bad-mouthed one way or another. Or there's a few occasions when I've not got the ritual entirely right, which doesn't particularly worry me. And very nicely, one of the acolytes said the other day, well, if that's how the bishop does it, that's how it's done. After that, I thought, well, I'll just do it my way. And
so no falling into grave stories.
I'm not falling. You don't take many funerals. You don't take many funerals. Luckily, these days, I've stood on several muddy graveyards in pouring rain over the years and shivered away.
It's just me as a
kept well away from the end. No, I wouldn't be doing that.
Bless. Spotlight. I'm going to finish with the game.
Good.
Okay. It's just a bit of fun, really.
Absolutely.
That's all it is. It kind of reveals who you are a little bit.
Good. Yeah. I'm not too defended.
Okay. What's your secret pleasure?
Secret pleasure is a quiet book. Sitting by a river reading.
Is that the kind of thing you do on your day off then?
No, we normally walk the dogs and go for a pub lunch somewhere.
Oh, very nice. Okay. Favourite cereal?
I don't really like cereals very much, but
Favourite breakfast?
yeah, muesli type stuff.
That's very healthy.
Yeah.
Dark chocolate or milk chocolate?
Well, I'd like a box that gives you a mixture, really.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so you have a bit of each.
Very ecumenical of you. Can you reverse park?
Excellently. I've got a camera that helps me do so in the back of the car.
Have you now?
I have.
Very posh. The job that you, if you weren't a bishop, the job that you'd most love to have?
That's quite good, isn't it? I should think I'd enjoy being, enjoy something out in the country, being a forester or something like
Something
that,
like
I
that.
think. Yeah, something that was outdoors, all weathers, gamekeeper, forester, that sort of country pursuit sort of person.
Nice. And if you could be any person for a day in the world right now, who would it be?
Oh, no, that's quite difficult to say, isn't it, really?
It is.
We're definitely not Mrs. May, as we're in the middle of a Brexit negotiation. So I think, in fact, nobody in this country, I wouldn't think, really. What would I like to do? I'm some sports person I'd like to be. I'd like to be, playing in some European Cup final.
Yeah, I'm with that one, actually.
Yeah.
I'm with that.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen an angel?
Well, I remember sitting in church and someone came and told me they were an angel and gave me a message from God. So possibly, yes.
Are we allowed
Never
to know?
saw them again. Saw them again.
Are we allowed to know what the message was?
It was a general message of encouragement. As I was sitting in St Andrew's Church in Plymouth, somebody came and said, well, I'm an angel, I've got a message to God from you.
How about that?
Yeah.
You're in heaven for the first time and Jesus is standing before you. What's the first thing that you'd like to ask him?
How on earth he'd allow someone like me in?
Yeah. You're in heaven for the first time and Jesus is standing before you. What would you like him to say to you?
That I'm accepted and loved for the person who I am.
Last one. You're in heaven for the first time. Who's the first, if I may ask this, family member you'd like to meet?
Oh, my wife.
Bless. Bishop Nick, you've been absolutely brilliant. Thank you
been
for
brilliant.
sharing your journey, for sharing your God story, for sharing the amazing ministry and the eclectic ministry you've had. There seems to be like an evolving thing here for the interviewees to pray us out, and I'm just wondering if you might do that, and particularly for those who are watching this who perhaps are going through challenging times at the moment. So if you'd be willing to sort of bear them in mind,
very pleased to pray.
that'd be absolutely wonderful.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah. Heavenly Father, we thank you that we're encouraged to taste and see that the Lord is good. And we pray for those in every sort of need at the moment, that whatever our questions, whatever our confidence, whatever the difficult situations that we're facing, that you would help us to trust you, to taste and see that you are good, that you love us as we are, and that you'd enable us to put ourselves afresh in your hands. And we ask it for your name's sake.